Welcome all. I am your host, the Contemplative Citizen, and welcome to Season 1, Climate Change, Hoax or Existential Threat. As you know, we are an open-air think tank where we the people come together today to draft legislative initiatives for tomorrow's most pressing, most urgent and impactful issues. It is January 12th, 2020. And it is our inaugural broadcast, so make sure you hit the bell notification button so you don't miss the live broadcast like today on Twitter at TCC1e1. And if you miss the inaugural broadcast or a live broadcast in the future, please subscribe to YouTube, The Contemplative Citizen, where we archive our content. Today begins Season 1. Our discussion on whether or not climate change is a hoax or existential threat. We begin with Episode 1, the CO2 origin story. First poll question. I would like to know which of the following statements best describes your view of carbon dioxide. Now, this is not an interactive poll, but leave your comments below on YouTube or in Twitter. Just tweet it out. Do you see it as a toxic gas that must be eliminated from our atmosphere? B, an essential life-giving gas that should not be feared at all? Or C, a hazardous greenhouse gas that must be regulated? All right, take a few minutes. Let me know what you think. Now we're going to move on to our story of CO2, the origin story. Our story begins in 2019 with Time's Person of the Year. Not so much because of her calls for climate strikes and her concern for carbon dioxide, but because of her familial lineage. Svante Arrhenius was her great-grandfather, and he is the origin of our concern over CO2 in the atmosphere and its effect on global warming. Now, Svante Arrhenius was a notable physicist in the early, let's call it the 19th century and early 1900s. So much so that when Alfred Nobel left his estate to create the Nobel Prize, Svante Arrhenius was on the founding committee of the Nobel Institute and was a member of the Nobel Committee on the Physical Sciences through 1927, from its founding in 1900 to 1927, his retirement, and he was also the winner of a Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1903, whereby he found that ions in inorganic reactions in solutions did in fact hold a charge. And he was the first scientist to consider the impact of CO2 on Earth's temperature. Now, not the first to originate the idea, but the first to dedicate to that considerable effort to do the observational science that was necessary to formulate the following equation that would be used in our climate methodologies till this very day. Arrhenius would dedicate his life out of a passion for his concern over the possible return of an ice age. So he really wanted to understand what was the initial cause of the ice age and how might mankind aid in preventing a second ice age. Kind of surprisingly and ironic is his idea was that if we were to burn fossil fuel, namely coal, that we could put enough CO2 in the atmosphere to warm it a few degrees so that we would avoid the coming of another ice age. Now his equation shown here on the screen, delta F equals alpha, the log of the ratio between carbon dioxide concentrations between some origin point in some current point. Generally, we look at that as C0 as the pre-industrial, some year pre-industrial, generally in the early 1900s, and sometimes going back as far as 1750. And the C here being the concentration of carbon dioxide at the present time. Now, to understand this, let's start with delta F. Delta F is the radiative force upon the Earth when you consider the Earth as an opaque object. This was part of his physical science back then, where they were studying if you heated an object, and how much of that heat would it retain, or that radiation would it retain as heat and release as heat. And he looked at the Earth in a similar fashion. And what he found was, it's not a solid mass, but it had this atmosphere, but overall it acted in a similar manner. And so he concluded that it was a logarithmic relationship between the ratio of carbon dioxide over any given period of time. And there was, as there are in many equations in chemistry and in physics, a constant that was observed, and his constant was that we take that ratio, that logarithmic assessment of that ratio, and multiply it times 5.35 watts per meter squared, and you have the change in radiative force that was created by a change in carbon dioxide. Now, those calculations are used today, and you don't have to take my word for it. Let's go to the next interview with William Tapper, who is a notable scientist in 2019. Let's hear what he has to say about this equation.
Thing about CO2, which is unique to CO2, it's not true, for example, of water vapor or methane, and that is that if you get 1 degree of warming from doubling CO2, so going from, say, 400 parts per million for simplicity to 800, that doubles it. Mm-hmm. Suppose that causes 1 degree of warming. Then to get another degree of warming, you have to double 800, so you have to go to 1600. So you have to double it again. So it gets harder and harder to warm. Technically, they call that the logarithmic dependence of temperature rise on CO2 concentration. It was first guessed at really by Svante Arrhenius, who did some of the earliest work on global warming. He thought it was good, he was all for global warming. But he was the first one to point out this doubling property of CO2. Nobody quite knows how he guessed it. It's correct.
Because he wasn't using computer models.
Well, it was before quantum mechanics. He didn't even know about spontaneous emission. It was before Planck. But nevertheless, he guessed it correctly.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it?
Quite a guy, yeah.
So, my fellow contemplative citizens, we hear that scientists today believe that Svante Arrhenius got it right. So let's compare. Our reference is the Climate Action and Support Trends of 2019 document, where they predicted or estimated the radiative force since the year 1750 to present, and they estimated that the effect was 4.1 watts per meter squared. Going back to Svante Arrhenius's logarithmic dependency equation, we take CO2 in 1750 as 270 parts per million, and CO2 in 2019, or more appropriately today, at 420 parts per million. And we calculate that the radiative forcing that occurred over that period was 4.417 watts per meter squared. Folks, that is scientifically and statistically identical to what the UN estimate for radiative forcing was over that period of time. So let me ask, does that give you confidence that we the people can agree that CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and global temperatures are logarithmically dependent, or more precisely, temperatures are logarithmic dependent on CO2 concentration. If we can agree on that, then we can say Svante Arrhenius is correct, or was correct, and we are in alignment with all scientists today on both sides of the spectrum. Both climate skeptics and climate alarmists all have agreed that to this radiative forcing and this greenhouse effect do impact global temperatures. If that's the case, then we can move forward to ask ourselves, the Climate Action Summit reinforced this concept that 1.5 degrees C is socially, economically, politically, and scientifically safe limit to what global warming can be endured over the coming century. We do some calculations. I hope you have an inquisitive mind, as we, the contemplative citizens, should have, and wonder what radiative forcing would be required to affect this 1.5 degrees C change. Well, we take 1.5 degrees C, we multiply it times the accepted and calculated 3.7 watts per meter squared per temperature, or per degree C rise, and we find that 5.55 watts per meter squared is the required radiative forcing to raise our temperatures, global temperatures on Earth, and that's near Earth, to the accepted 1.5 degrees C change espoused by the UN. Now we have all the information that we need to begin to calculate what that parts per million concentration of CO2 would look like in 2100 at that threshold. So we know delta F is going to be the 5.55 watts per meter squared. We know alpha is a constant, 5.35 watts per meter squared. We know C naught is the 420 parts per million today. And so if we speed through the calculation and solve for the concentration of CO2 in 2100, what we find is that concentration has to be 1,180 parts per million of CO2. That is a 740 parts per million change in concentration levels of CO2 in our atmosphere. That would be 5 times the change that we've observed today since the year 1750. But it feels like to me that if all the scientists agree, and I asked you earlier whether you agree, that this logarithmic dependency of global temperatures on CO2 concentrations, more specifically ratio of concentrations at one point in time to another, is a good predictor or causal effect for global temperature change, then we might have our first metric. And this is where I would like to end today. I would like to ask whether we have enough information, enough confidence to agree that the radiative forcing equation put forth by Svante Arrhenius gives us an accurate calculation of what CO2 concentrations would be safe in the future. If it is, then maybe that's our first legislative priority, is to suggest that there be a mechanism globally to begin tracking CO2 parts per million in our atmosphere. And that's near Earth, right? Just like temperatures are near Earth temperatures. These are near Earth concentrations of CO2. It seems like today's equipment ought to be able to get that number quickly. So I'm going to leave that with you. Leave your comments below. Would you agree on a scale of 1 to 10, let's say, instead of making a binary choice, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much are we the people aligned with the statement that would say global governments and the UN should be tracking CO2 concentration levels measured in parts per million of other atmospheric gases? Can you get behind that? Let me know. 1 says, no way, don't like it at all. 10 says, absolutely, that's perfectly reasonable, let's do it. Let me know what you think. That conclusion, we end our episode 1 of season 1, Climate Change, Hoax or Existential Threat. That has been episode 1, CO2 Origin Story. We asked you for your comments on Twitter. I hope you caught us live and participated in the discussion. But if not, go to YouTube, look at The Contemplative Citizen, and leave your comments below. We have 1 week before the next episode will come to you live. I will take your comments into account. I'll give the 5 first commenters a shout out. So if you'd like a shout out, please leave your comments below for CO2, the origin story. And this is the Contemplative Citizen signing off and thanking you for your participation.